Welcome to China in Context from the SOAS China Institute at the University of London. I'm Duncan Hewitt. Donald Trump's visit to Beijing in mid-May, the first by a US president in 9 years, was marked by pageantry, visits to historic sites, and a banquet attended by technology titans from both sides. His summit with Xi Jinping also produced some apparently substantive agreements. China has said it will buy 200 aircraft from Boeing and also resume purchases of US beef and US soybeans, which had fallen victim to recent trade and tariff wars. The two countries also pledged to set up a joint board of trade to resolve future disputes, along with another for investment, though some key areas of contention, including sales of the most advanced US microchips to China, were apparently not discussed. Nor did China's readout of the two leaders' discussions refer to the situation in the Middle East, though the US said Beijing had been cooperative on the issue. One thing the two sides did agree on was that they will seek to establish what's been described as a constructive relationship of strategic stability. So what does all this mean in real terms? And in the longer term? Well, later I'll be talking to Professor Steve Zhang, director of the SOAS China Institute and a specialist in Chinese politics. But first, I'm joined by Melinda Liu, the veteran Beijing bureau chief of Newsweek magazine, who has covered US presidential visits to China since Ronald Reagan's trip to the country in 1984. Well, Melinda, thanks so much for joining us. So the mood music on this visit seemed pretty positive. Donald Trump called Xi Jinping his friend and hailed their trade deals as fantastic. And the two leaders went for walks at the Temple of Heaven in Beijing and around the Chinese leadership compound at Zhongnanhai. So after all the tension of the past year, what does this tell us about what the two sides wanted from the summit and their relative strength at this point?
Thanks, Duncan, and thank you for having me. I think you just pinpointed the most important thing about this. It is that the power balance this time round during this summit had shifted clearly, and China had the upper hand in a way that it maybe had not been so clear before. And in that regard, as far as Xi Jinping is concerned, it was probably fine not to get bogged down in the weeds of things, because essentially both of them were in imperial mode and each was probably trying to out-empire the other in a weird way. But of course, if you've ever seen foreign leaders visit China, there's no way to out-empire China on its home ground. And again, they got this thousands of years of history and all these great monuments. So already Xi Jinping, just by the fact that it's in Beijing, he would have a bit of an advantage. And then the fact that the Iran war was not going the way the US had hoped it would be going, and it was not resolved by the time he got here, thus putting the US in a weaker position. Okay, so what are the imperial modes of these two leaders and their cultures? Well, for Trump, it was keen for him, with his eye on the stock market, to show that this is one stable relationship that's not going to upset the whole global market and send the Dow tumbling and all that stuff. And to do that, he would show how close he was to Xi and how friendly they were and how they agreed on so many things. From Xi Jinping, the imperial mode is actually quite different. For him, it doesn't really matter whether they're friends or not. He just wants to establish that, okay, we do have a relationship and it's stable and it's in our interest to keep it stable. And so he didn't get into all the praising and I mean, he was friendly, he was smiling quite a lot. But, for him, it wasn't important to show friendship. It was important to show empire, imperial behavior and imperial status. So he's kind of coming at it like in the old days, when the Chinese emperor would sometimes be visited by so-called barbarian kings from the western margins of China, and they would come bearing tribute and wanting stuff and wanting protection or whatever. And the emperor could be polite or sometimes could be rude, but in this case, politeness, showing a certain level of generosity. And so that's where the Boeings and beans come in. Of course, China normally used to buy a lot of planes from Boeing, and then there was a dry spell when there were none. And so the expectation would be that there would be a Boeing deal in there, and there it wasn't entirely concrete by the time Trump left, but it had happened. Similarly, the beans part of it, the agricultural goods that China would buy from the States, so that there was something happening there.
The
But
soybeans, which China had
yes,
effectively stopped buying during the tariff wars last
right.
year and had been buying from Brazil and other places instead.
Exactly, exactly. And it's astounding to me that Trump acknowledged that tariffs was not a big focus of this. Okay, so this is again each of them is behaving like the emperor, where underlings get their hands dirty, negotiating where the decimal points go and, all the tonnage and the dollars and the whatever, whatever. But the emperors, they work on their relationship and their country's interests. So that sort of suited Xi Jinping fine. He kind of won the tariff war, so he doesn't have to raise it again and again. Leave it to lower level people to sort out. I think if you go back to say the 1980s, which is when I first worked in China, it was very, very clear that China needed the US more than the US needed China. And the whole relationship kind of went from there. Then, more recently, you could say there was a period where it wasn't clear who needed the other more, and there was a bit of, competition, rivalry, animosity, or whatever. I think we're getting to a point where the US needs China more than China needs the US. And so Xi Jinping can afford to look magnanimous. Trump basically came across as sort of seeking approval, seeking to have this good relationship with Xi, claiming that he had a good relationship, but in a very hopeful way, as if like, oh, I hope he returns the favor, and shows the cameras that he's returning the favor.
So obviously, this sort of imperial mode of Xi Jinping, it involved taking Donald Trump to these great, as you say, places of Chinese history, like the Temple of Heaven, which Donald Trump seemed quite excited about, and also taking him around Zhongnanhai. And Trump said, "Oh, do you bring many people here?" And he said, "Well, I brought Vladimir Putin." And of course, Vladimir Putin has now followed him back to Beijing, immediately, which
Yes.
obviously sends a certain message. So, in a sense, the message is, from the Chinese point of view, and the message for the Chinese public, I guess, is that China is very much at the center of the world these days. And this presumably looks very nice for Xi Jinping from that point of view. And then they had this banquet, which was, did seem to be designed to appear as friendly as possible. And not only had the US brought various tech bosses, Elon Musk and Tim Cook, and then Jensen Huang, the world's leading chip manufacturer, appeared at the last minute. But again, the chips, the substantive issue, and the ongoing confrontation over chips does not seem to have been a key part of the agenda of the two leaders' talks. But there were a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs at this banquet as well, and I believe that the band played, that Xi Jinping got the Chinese military band to play YMCA because it's Donald Trump's favorite song by the village people. So, obviously on some level they were trying to be, from, as you say, China looking magnanimous. But at the end of it all, there was this phrase that came out that the two sides had agreed to build a constructive relationship of strategic stability. And there has been a suggestion that that's a framework that China has come up with, which in a way would limit the US's ability to perhaps impose sanctions or to challenge it quite as much as it has done, or as some of Donald Trump's supporters would like it to. I mean, do you think that's significant?
I think it's significant that the US would adopt this language because this is very much China's language. So when they say strategic stability, I think the Chinese are looking for something that also goes beyond Trump. From the Chinese point of view, particularly from this emperor perspective, Trump is already a lame duck. Even if something weird happened and he was around for, more years than we expect, China's already looking for something that will still be true after Trump. And so strategic stability, it has the sound of something permanent almost, a platform upon which, all future relations and trade and everything can rest. It's a
Yes.
solid thing. And they also want to show Chinese people that they know how to manage this relationship regardless of the leader. And so it's all kind of appearance and perception and rhetoric, but I think China got a lot from the US to get them to sign on to this idea. Basically, I think Beijing is already in sort of long-term mode. They want to see a stable trajectory so that they don't have to go through disruptive changes every time a new president comes aboard. And I went around talking with a lot of Chinese friends, about this. Well, some of them would say, "Oh yeah, we like Trump. Yeah, he's good for China." And one of them said, "I wouldn't say I like him, but I like to watch him because it's so entertaining." So they find him amusing. But I think Xi Jinping revealed himself in that comment, which the New York Times picked up when people were discussing Trump's imminent second election. He was running for president again. And Xi Jinping said, if Americans want to choose such an immature leader as their president, we know who to blame. So, that I think is very revealing. He does have a kind of a superiority complex here. She has. Yeah, he's got to humor Trump and stroke him in the way that, the Chinese know how to do it. The last time he was here, they just put a lot of gold bling bling stuff all around him, like I mean these were treasures from the Forbidden City, but they know how to do it. And so he was happy.
Because actually, back in the US, there has been a suggestion from Democratic opponents in Congress, but also from some Republicans, that Donald Trump has to some extent been sort of played by China, particularly when it comes to Taiwan. And he came out with these comments, not in his official press conference, but in an interview afterwards with Fox News, where he said he was thinking whether or not to sell more arms or to finally authorize the latest arms sale package to Taiwan, because it might encourage the Taiwanese leadership to sort of formally declare independence, which they have not done, and there's no suggestion they are immediately about to do this. But the phrase he used, was of William Lai, the Taiwanese president. He said they have somebody there now that wants to go independent. If you kept it the way it is, I think China's going to be okay with that. But we're not looking to have somebody say, let's go independent because the United States is backing us. And this has clearly caused a big stir also in Taiwan, whether Taiwan can no longer kind of rely on the US. On the other hand, of course, Donald Trump, until recently, was putting a lot of pressure on Taiwan to pay more money and buy more weapons and pay for its own defense. So has China, in a sense, got what everybody thinks it was hoping to do from Donald Trump, to get him to start perhaps changing his position on Taiwan, on whether or not the US would formally say that it supported or at least didn't oppose peaceful reunification, which is China's goal?
Well, first of all, let me say, even if it weren't Trump, any president, US president, talking about Taiwan is already going to be a little nerve-wracking because there are so many subtleties and so many nuances and so much history and baggage involved in just simply talking about Taiwan that it's hard for an American president or an American period, anybody, to say anything that could not be interpreted as, changing something or the other. So for Trump to simply say what he said, on the surface, you could say, well, it's a reasonable thing to say, but I think it was just enough to give the Chinese leadership some satisfaction that, oh, he's coming around to our point of view. There's so much about the Taiwan relationship that normally is left unsaid, but Trump tried to say something. But he did it in a way that very few past presidents have done. So of course the Chinese kind of looked at that and they went, that's not too bad. Trump, we already know it, that he doesn't talk about, oh, we're going to defend Taiwan because it's a democracy. What he probably could say is, hey, they're going to buy this and that and the other thing from America, so we should help them out a little bit. That might work.
Mm.
Very transactional. But even with that, China can say, well, we'll buy 200 Boeings, we'll buy 500 Boeings. What do you think of that? Does that mean you're going to be our ally? So they know they can Trump, if I may say that, if it's all down to money and business that can be done between two entities.
Of course, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, said afterwards that, the US policy on Taiwan remains unchanged.
I think in the nuance department, China got something to feel satisfied
Mm,
about during
mm.
this trip.
But in terms of, from your experience of being in Beijing and, as you say, talking to many people there, what is your feeling of how people in China are thinking about the relationship with the US at the moment after, a year and a half of tariff wars and threats and all of that?
I think they're feeling, oh, maybe things are turning around and getting better. I think they're probably pretty happy that no dramatic negative repercussions came out, that everyone was smiling. It seemed to be fine. Business was being done to a certain extent. But I don't think anyone thinks this is going to be forever. Is this really a strategically stable relationship, given what Taiwan's all about, given what the world is all about? I think the only comfort that China could really get from what's going on with the US and Trump now is simply that the geopolitical situation for this trip that Trump just made to China was giving China a stronger hand than it might have been because Iran has the US on the back foot. They don't know how to get out of it. They look at what's happening in Ukraine and they don't see the US, with a full-throated support of Zelensky. So the whole separatism issue with Taiwan, they would extrapolate from that and say, well, maybe he doesn't really care about spunky small countries, even if they are democratic. What's different is that they're thinking in a much different time frame. They're
Mm.
thinking like 10 years, 20 years. And I think what she wanted to do is just make sure that as much as he could, in terms of the nations, China and the US, that he put it on a strategically stable trajectory for a long time to come.
Well, Melinda Liu, thank you so much for joining us
Yeah.
from Beijing.
Thanks so much, Duncan.
Well, I'm joined now by Professor Steve Zhang, Director of the SOAS China Institute and co-author of the book The Political Thought of Xi Jinping. So, Steve, to start with some of the concrete details, how far do you think that the establishment of this new joint US-Chinese Board of Trade will go towards stabilising the two countries' trade relationship in the coming year or two?
I think it will have stabilized the relationship between China and the United States in terms of the economic, trade, tariff, and investment relationship. And this is because the world's most powerful country sent a president who played its card so remarkably unwisely that it enabled the world's second most powerful country to enjoy a game and win it across the board. Because whatever are going to be agreed, it is fairly clear that the Chinese are saying if you play it in a way that is appropriate from Beijing's perspective, we can talk about everything and all will be fine. So no more tariff wars in the way that Donald Trump had started his second term. It will be things that have to be discussed and agreed, and having the frameworks to do so, which start off as an American idea, is one that would work pretty well from Beijing's perspective, because they are effectively preempting Donald Trump from dropping the kind of bombshells that were being dropped in the first few months of his second term, which the Chinese did not appreciate.
So you say Donald Trump played his cards so unwisely. What specific are you referring to this particular visit or to the way he's handled the whole trade saga over the last year?
Well, Donald Trump is in a difficult position because of the results of the attack on Iran, and therefore the damages done to US negotiating positions with China. But that doesn't change the reality that even Xi Jinping acknowledges that the United States at the moment remains the most powerful country. And therefore, there is leverage that he could have used. But then you cannot really achieve your key objectives if you don't even know what your key objectives are and what you want to achieve. And so the Chinese play that very well. You want a mechanism for negotiations. We agree to the mechanism. We agreed to a mechanism for maintaining relationships on an even keel, but we have not agreed to any specifics. So if the Trump administration have specific details in terms of what their preferred framework, a block of trade and a block of investments would be, then normally they would have been agreed to before Mr. President went on board Air Force Ones to fly from Washington to Beijing. That clearly didn't happen. I think the Chinese have already achieved what they want to achieve, which is to have a mechanism that requires the Americans to talk to them if they want something being done about it.
So, in other words, the Americans can't just slap tariffs on randomly as they have been doing in the last year.
Well, a Trump administration can do anything, as we have seen, but that would be on Washington. And that will fundamentally damage an American initiative in setting up a block of trade and a block of investment if they simply move forward ignoring both instruments that are being agreed and in due course being set up. So from that perspective, the Chinese are in a pretty good place in simply conceding officially what the Americans have asked for, but in fact succeeded to achieve what they want to achieve, which is to stabilize relationship in a way that is more favorable to China than the unguided way that had happened in the first 6 months of the second Trump administration.
You talk about stabilizing. I mean, it was also very striking that the two sides seem to have agreed to at least the idea of what they're calling a constructive relationship of strategic stability. What does that really mean? Because that sounds very much like a kind of Chinese government formulation, the type of language they love to use in describing relations with other countries. Is this somewhere, whereas I think some of Donald Trump's critics in the US have said, the US has very much bought into an idea that suits China?
I think you put your fingers on it when you underline that it's their kind of language. But I think there is a bit more to it than that as well, which is that Xi Jinping also said, if our relationship are being handled well, then we can develop this constructive strategic stability in our relationship. And it can be a win-win, good for both sides, rather than a confrontation which will be damaging to both sides. Now, all these were being spoken by Xi Jinping in Beijing, in a city within a country in which every single word that Xi Jinping say is and must be true and correct. So the implication was quite clear. If both sides have to handle that relationship well, China, by definition, has always handled it well. The only one that requires adjustment to handle it well would be the United States of America. And President Trump either didn't understand that, or he did, but did not push back. Either way, the message is pretty clear. China is defining the parameter for how they could have a constructive, strategic, stable relationship moving forward, and the Americans have effectively acquiesced to what the Chinese say.
But, you know, as we noted, Donald Trump did bring some of the most hawkish people in his administration with him to China, including the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, his advisor, Stephen Miller, and the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. Do you think that all of these people, the entire administration, really buys into this idea? And are they serious about it? Or in some ways, do they still think that perhaps they can say lots of polite things to China and get Xi Jinping to visit the US later this year, which Donald Trump clearly thinks will be good for him and help him look presidential before the midterm elections, and yet perhaps at the same time continue with some of the, slapping sanctions on Chinese imports or some of the more hardline things they've been doing in the last year or so?
I think Donald Trump again has played a Chinese game, because in negotiations between China and a major foreign power, it is always Xi Jinping who speaks for China, and his teams would stay quiet and support him. And we have the same with the Americans on this occasion that all the American hawks on China in the American delegation stay quiet and let Mr. President speak for the United States. So if there was a message that was being seen in Beijing, it is that with President Trump in charge in the White House, they could afford not to worry too much about the American hawks because the hawks were being tamed or contained by Mr. President, who is now being engaged effectively at the head of state level to become a friend of China rather than something else that he was previously. And as far as Xi Jinping is concerned, should he be worried if his visit to Washington in September should end up helping the Trump administration to secure or hold on to the House and Senate? Well, if that should happen, it wouldn't worry them too much. A Trump administration, in spite of the headaches that Trump threw at Beijing in his first 6 months, has been more useful to Beijing than the previous Biden administration, which was very steady in how it dealt with China, and in that sense was actually harder line than the Trump administration is at the moment when dealing with China. And therefore, from that perspective, keeping Trump being able to lead the United States is beneficial to China.
Well, one area where there's definitely been some pushback in the US already is on the comments that Donald Trump made on Taiwan, which we discussed earlier with Melinda Liu, and this idea that he's currently delaying an arms sale package to Taiwan. And he's saying, this is a bargaining chip. And that's caused some alarm in Taiwan as well. So do you feel that China has significantly influenced Donald Trump on Taiwan, or is this just him doing his usual kind of brinkmanship and playing games?
I think once again, we have seen the Chinese play that one-upmanship game with Donald Trump and came out tops. Xi Jinping said from the very beginning of the summit that Taiwan was of utmost importance to China, and it's a relationship that, if not being handled well, could result in war between China and the US. But if handled properly, then it would not, and it could be a mutually beneficial one. Once again, what I said earlier about the context of the summit applies. Since China's policy towards Taiwan is by definition always and must always be right, the only one that needs to make adjustment is the United States of America. And again, the American president did not push back.
He seems to claim that he's still holding some cards, and that he hasn't made a final decision on the latest arms sales.
I would certainly give him credit in that he did not simply say, yes, Chairman Xi Jinping, you're right. He didn't say that. He kept quiet about it. But no American president before Donald Trump ever discussed arms sales to Taiwan with the Chinese leader. Donald Trump did. And that is a major concession to Xi Jinping. And for the president to say that because the Chinese have raised these kind of issues, I am going to have a conversation with the leader of Taiwan, whose name he could not even remember, really does not put it in a very good light. But then when we are dealing with US-Taiwan-China relationship, we are also dealing with a politically structured issue in Washington. Congress has a significant say in the matter, and I think we are already seeing some pushback. But all I can say is that Trump had unwittingly still given Beijing a gift, which Xi Jinping is almost certainly celebrating.
And how do you think that all of this affects China's view about the Taiwan question? You know, obviously, we've also had the Iran war going on, as you mentioned, and there's been some suggestions that China has, like with the Gulf War in 2003, been struck by US military capacity, and particularly the way that they're now using AI in their military strategy, and that this could put China off any idea of potentially trying to take control of Taiwan by force. How do you feel about that? You know, do you think that in the context of what Donald Trump's saying, that will encourage China further to think that reunification can be achieved soon, or are these two separate issues really?
What I think we have to bear in mind is that Xi Jinping is different from previous Chinese leaders. Xi Jinping has put forward a clear global strategy for China, of which Taiwan is a key part. So he defines how China will deal with the Taiwan issue and the timetable for resolving it to his satisfaction. He is therefore not going to change his timetable simply because of something that Washington does or doesn't do. 2049, which is the year for which the China dream of national rejuvenation is meant to be fully fulfilled. That would be the final year in Xi Jinping's timetable for taking Taiwan, one way or the other. But Xi Jinping has also indicated that he is aware of the significance of American use of force in Iran, as well as Russian use of force in Ukraine. And the clear lesson is that you do not go and use force until and unless you are very well prepared. And simply having greater force may not deliver the result you want if you are not well prepared. But you have always an alternative. If you could set the Americans to move more in the direction of the Trump administration and sustain that, then you are more likely as China to be able to deter a future US administration from interfering over Taiwan. And if that could be achieved, a clear demonstration of overwhelming Chinese military might against Taiwan might well be able to secure Taiwan to accept Chinese terms.
Without actually using military force.
I think they would still prefer that there will be a deployment of force, but the mere deployment of force rather than the commitment of forces into combat will deliver the result. Xi Jinping's objective over Taiwan is not to kill Taiwanese and destroy Taiwan. He wants to take Taiwan and get all the benefits of it. And Donald Trump would indicate that there can be American presidents, at least Donald Trump was one of them, who could be persuaded to not force China to have to resort to the actual commitment of force in combat. But having said that, may I just add that that was not Xi Jinping's plan anyway. There's really no indication that Xi Jinping was planning to use force to attack Taiwan before the end of the second Trump administration. And the reason is quite simply that the Chinese military are not ready for such an operation. And that is also why he could afford to reshuffle or indeed purge his high command in the way that he had done in the last 6 months. He is believing that the purge of the military high command will result in strengthening the capacity and preparedness of the military for the eventual operation against Taiwan when he is ready to do so. So he is not in a hurry.
He's playing a long game. And we've touched on the conflict in the Middle East and what's happened in Iran. I mean, this was somewhere where during the visit, the US side referred to it in their statement and said that the two sides had agreed that Iran should never have nuclear weapons, and that they shared a desire to have the Strait of Hormuz reopened and that tolls should not be charged there. But China didn't really mention this. Do you think that Beijing is in any way playing a useful role from the US point of view in terms of making progress on ending this conflict?
From Washington's perspective, Beijing has played a very positive role by not contradicting the American readout of the statement on Iran. And that was important for the Trump administration, something that they could chalk it up as a win. But the Chinese position has fundamentally remained the same as it was before the summit. China has called for the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz for quite a while. China has more ships that need to sail through the Strait of Hormuz than any other country. And therefore, they don't want the imposition of a transit fee because it means China will pay more than anybody else. China has not been a party to the Iranian nuclear weapons program. And if the Trump administration had asked China to help to resolve the Iranian program matter in terms of securing what were being buried under rubbles of American bombing, the Chinese clearly would have told them they were not interested or able to help. It's an American mess which requires America to clean up and clear up. China is not coming to step into it to clear that mess for Trump.
But do you think China is happy for this conflict to go on because it is becoming something of a mess for the US, or do they really want the war to end because they want trade and economic progress to resume and to not be affected long term?
They want both. And there's no reason why they shouldn't actually want both. They want the Strait of Hormuz to be reopened, but they don't want the relationship between Iran and the United States to be put on an even keel and put an end to the trouble that the United States faces. And they are not going to help America to put Iran in a situation to appear to have been defeated. They want the straits open for business, but they are not going to push it. If they use all their leverage, they will have to effectively threaten the Iranians that they will stop the economic relationship with Iran, as Iran depends very heavily on Chinese energy purchase for its economic stability. That is simply not on the cards for the Chinese. They are not going to do that. They don't want to ruin the Iranian economy. They will be potentially seeking the Iranians to provide special arrangements for Chinese ships to sail through the Strait of Hormuz. But then they would not want to be saying that they only are asking for the reopening of the straits for themselves. They would like to be saying that they would like the straits to be reopened, period.
So, I mean, from what you're saying, China is playing quite a complicated balancing act. And we've seen another indication of that with the fact that Vladimir Putin has visited Beijing within a few days of Donald Trump's visit. Do you think that's designed directly by Beijing to send a message to the US and to the world that, China chooses who it deals with, and also perhaps to send a message to the Chinese people that, okay, Donald Trump came and we were nice to him, but that doesn't mean that he has a sort of influence over who our friends are and what our policies are?
So it is entirely possible that the date of Putin's visit was decided before the Trump visit was rescheduled as a result of the war in Iran. So the timing could be accidental rather than deliberate. Having said that, the Chinese certainly do not feel that there is any reason why they should change the date for Putin's visit simply because Trump would have visited a few days earlier. And that is exactly for the reasons you have put forward, namely that the Chinese are confident that they are now in a position to set parameters in terms of how it engages with both the United States and Russia, and for that matter, any other major power. And if Washington doesn't like it, tough.
So despite the relationship of strategic stability and the talk of a win-win situation, it sounds like you think China has won more from the US visit this time round.
Well, that is the long-standing Chinese approach under the Communist Party. When they say win-win, it can mean both sides winning. It can also mean China winning twice. Or in some cases, it's China winning twice, but allowing you to appear that you are winning too, which effectively was the template that was being used for the Trump visit to Beijing. That is enough for Trump to declare that he had a great visit with many things that he has achieved. But China achieved more, perhaps even more than they might have thought they could achieve before the visit.
And it has been suggested that, with this more formalized type of relationship that China clearly at least wants to now build with the US, that in some ways it's also perhaps using that to calm the waters a little and in a way to buy time for its own technological rise and for the construction of this technological self-sufficiency that is so important to the Chinese leadership and that, was included in the latest 5-year plan of the Chinese government. Is that their goal from these kind of agreements?
I think that was certainly what they would like to achieve, to get more time for China to play catch up and therefore surpass the United States in specific areas that they have chosen. But I think it is also that if you are the number two, negotiating with number one, and you are able to lay down the framework for that engagement, then you have achieved a great diplomatic success. And this is, I think, what they thought they have managed to achieve with the Trump visit to Beijing. So it was a very successful visit from the perspective of the Trump administration, but it was an amazing victory from the perspective of Xi Jinping's Zhongnanhai.
Well, Professor Steve Zhang, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
That's all we have time for on this episode. You can find out more about SOAS China Institute events and read our blog articles on our website soas.ac.uk. For now, thanks for listening and goodbye.